Hey adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. I'm a partner at Cimpatico Studios, where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience of your professional peers on Cimpatico.tv. I'm building a new type of online community for professionals like yourself on the Climate Adaptation channel. If you're a regular listener of my America Adapts podcast, I think you'll find that we're taking our conversations about important problems, policies, and solutions to the next level here. And if you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now join us for this latest episode. Hey adapters, today our guest is Sara Moore. Sara is a researcher and analyst with a double master's in public policy and international studies from UC Berkeley. Her work emphasizes climate change adaptation planning in an applied context. She has 12 years of experience with nonprofit community organizing and advocacy for human rights, environmental justice, and protected area management. Sara will discuss the causes behind permafrost melting and its impact on indigenous communities. She explores the reasons why these communities are more vulnerable to permafrost melting than others, and also how much better equipped they are to defend themselves against the adverse effects of permafrost melting. Hey, Sara, welcome to the show.
Hey, nice to see you, Doug.
Hey, Sara, I was thinking, we actually got a chance to meet in person, and I think it was at a National Adaptation Forum. Was it St. Louis or Wisconsin? Do you recall?
Or both. I think both, actually.
All right. Well, it's good to see you. I'm glad we're doing this interview, but we have a history doing adaptation work because you've been doing it for a while, right?
Yeah.
Well, we're going to talk about permafrost in indigenous communities, but I thought it'd be useful to maybe just start off with some fundamentals. Not everyone actually knows what permafrost is. Could you explain?
Yeah, so I have learned in preparing to answer that question that you actually aren't supposed to talk about permafrost melting because it isn't ice. It's ground, which can be soil, sediment, rock, also potentially ice, that is at or below 0 degrees Celsius for 2 or more consecutive years. And that condition can occur anywhere, not just the Arctic, not just the poles. You have discontinuous patches of it in highlands, mountainous areas around the world, in the Himalayas, in the Altai, in Russia, and also, of course, at the poles. And then in Alaska, for example, you have patches in some places. It's not like you get to a certain latitude and it's continuous up to the poles. It appears where it appears, and it's not ice necessarily, but sometimes ice is mixed in. So you have thawing combining with melting, combining with other processes. And I'm not a specialist in geomorphology, but it's an interesting and I think probably not terribly well understood process, the loss of permafrost or the thawing of permafrost.
Okay, so and correct me when I use the wrong terminology, because I think I have melting in here. And I think I've actually, if I've been on permafrost, it was probably in the montane situation. But Have you been in, let's say in Alaska in the tundra, have you actually walked on it?
Yeah. So a previous job that I held was at an organization called Pacific Environment that supported indigenous communities in the North Pacific Rim, looking at Siberia, Russian Far East, Alaska, and I helped conduct a cultural exchange of people from Cimpatico, Russia, to visit Bethel, Alaska, and I got to see, infrastructure built on permafrost and how permafrost is used as part of a sort of the natural infrastructure of the land in Alaska.
Okay, so melting isn't necessarily the right terminology, maybe thawing, and so, but even just
yeah.
What is that process and what is the evidence that's actually happening?
Well, it turns out that they've been measuring and looking, hindcasting through data, trying to figure out when did this all start happening, this process of the thawing of permafrost. And they've got evidence in one case going back 60 years in Alaska, where they found that the line of permafrost seems to have migrated 25 kilometers northward already since the 60s. So now at the moment, there is a robust network of monitoring going on, people doing monitoring in communities around the north in the Arctic to look at how permafrost is behaving all over the place. It's pretty much the best they can do right now in terms of adapting to permafrost changes is just monitoring it right now. But yeah, there's increasing amounts of data being analyzed, and they are getting more and more information about how it's changing in different places.
This might be too in the weeds, but have you heard anything? Because I just, you hear about methane release with the permafrost thawing. Is that even a public health issue with indigenous communities, or is it maybe too spread out? Have you even heard anything along those lines?
There are many public health issues relevant to the discussion of thawing permafrost, and CO2 emissions and methane emissions are not at the top of the list. What that is a concern for is the long-term health of the whole planet with the feedback loops that are happening. It turns out permafrost is really dense and rich and full of things that are decaying. And so as it melts, we have these bubbling up, giant bubbles of methane and CO2 being released. And so what was a carbon sink or a GHG, greenhouse gas sink, is now turning into a source. And this is going to speed up climate change globally.
Yeah, it seems like every few months you hear a new story about they find this kind of release. But let's talk about the impact on indigenous communities. What are the implications? I guess what are some of the impacts in regards to people living there on top of the permafrost? What are those impacts that are going to impact them, their ability to live there?
Well, I'll tell you, my first encounter with this question was in 2007 when I was working at Pacific Environment. We had a colleague who was living in Siberia, and he was relaying, sort of messages from the field, like what he was seeing and what problems he was encountering working with indigenous communities and what they were seeing. And he was talking about how the reindeer pastures and migration routes had become thawed. They had become squishy and could not be traversed safely. And so people were having to go way out of their way, or they were just losing access to pastures because they were turning into swamps. And that's when it kind of hit me that climate change isn't something that's going to happen in the next generation. It's going to happen to us now, and is happening to these communities. And these communities depend on that permafrost and other aspects of the cryosphere, ice-bound land and sea, to continue their traditional cultures that they've been maintaining for thousands and thousands of years. And so it hit me in waves, like, okay, if this community cannot maintain its migration routes and pastures for its reindeer herding, where are they going to go? Like, what does that mean for their culture? What happens when a culture loses its land and its practices? Because it has to change. So this kind of sat with me. And as I developed my career in climate change work, I just never lost sight of how the indigenous communities are the canary in the coal mine in terms of how their culture is going to have to change. And as it's well known now that some communities are having to relocate off the eroded edges of riverine systems in Alaska because of the loss of integrity in the permafrost. So, for example, Nutuk has had to move to Merkavik, and about a third of the population has moved, and 2/3 is still waiting for funding to move. So these are our first climate refugees in the US, is these communities that are having to physically move because their land is going to be gone.
Well, what are you hearing from, and you work with these groups, and I guess you're following where some of these communities, like the impact, but on the ground, what are they saying about it? Are they just saying it's impacting our ability to, to hunt, or like even I hear about roads because you no longer can even maintain a road because of shifting things. What are the people saying in the ground in these communities?
I think the most for most people, the alarming thing is the threat to the food systems. So coastal communities that are used to ice roads and permafrost, sort of safe, reliable permafrost roads for shoulder season access, that's no longer reliable. So for safety, like getting to medical care and getting to supplies, you may not have a landing strip anywhere near your community. And so you're just cut off for months at a time. And that has also mental health implications. I think it was the 2008 climate adaptation report for Canada that was first to mention that the loss of these ice roads and the loss of the integrity of the transportation structure has resulted in an escalation of depression and suicide in these isolated communities, where it wasn't a good statistic to begin with. So there's just creeping on cascading effects from isolation that starts with access to food, threats to the access to food, And of course, hunting has changed. And like I said, reindeer herding has changed because of the changes to ice, sea ice and permafrost. It's no longer safe to hunt off of the ice. I'm sure you've heard these stories about the walruses that have started hauling out on land in massive, because they don't have ice anymore to haul out on. They haul out on land where they are more at risk of predators. So it's not safe for hunters to approach them because they'll start a stampede that will kill the young. So that's walrus is a major food source for coastal indigenous communities, and they cannot hunt the walrus like they used to. And what does that mean again for their food security and their culture? It's yet to be seen, but it's not looking good.
Right. So the thawing of the permafrost is yet another challenge that indigenous communities have to deal with. Just structural racism, lack of resources going to these communities.
Yeah.
Is there a silver lining to it, or is it again just another sort of like a challenge that they have to deal with? What are they seeing? Are people out there trying to help them?
I'm not sure I can find a silver lining here, but I do know that these communities have adapted all over the world. Indigenous communities have been subjected to threats both from racism, structural problems, environmental degradation. All of that has been threatening their communities. It's so weird how indigenous communities, their land tends to overlap with natural resources that need to be extracted. It's just all over the world, always been a problem. So they've been working to try and survive through these threats for a long time. So they have resources in a sense that other communities may not have. They have cultural communities. I mean, they have sometimes funded organizations that will help maintain the culture as they have to adapt, so that they have some structures in place, soft structures and hard structures, to keep them from going too far adrift. But ultimately, I'm not sure there's funding in place to help all of these communities find a place. I think what's more likely to happen is piecemeal families pushing off, to a new shore somewhere else. And then what happens to that, the microculture of a village, or, which is all a component of the larger culture of cryospheric culture, is it going to ultimately morph into something that's unrecognizable, or is it going to somehow be maintained through these institutions that have been built up over years to try and help these communities adapt to other threats? It's yet to be seen, but I feel like they have lessons to teach other communities in terms of how to pull together, have a community mindset, do a community evaluation of, when is it time to move? What are our values in our moving process? In Alaska, there's organizations, there's one organization that you may have heard of. They presented a couple of times at the different national adaptation forums, the Alaska Institute for Justice. They're trying to build a model for communities to move while maintaining their sense of dignity and their human rights, and to have it be dictated by the needs and the wishes of the tribe instead of the government coming in and saying, we're moving you, which is, of course, anathema.
Well, you shared some really good background materials, and you've touched upon it, but some people might say, all right, well, we'll provide some resources to help you move from this area to that area, but there's more at play there. I mean, what's at stake? And you talked a little bit about the cultural impact of these tribes moving to different areas, but again, what's at stake when these people have to move?
Well, a very tiny little micro story that's very interesting is that the 1/3 of Nutuk that moved to Murktavik, this new community, I think it's about 10 miles away, when this election came around, there was no evidence that anyone lived there because it was a brand new village. They couldn't vote because it's like, no one told someone that needed to tell someone else that there was a new village, and these people have a new address and they need to be able to vote. So that's a tiny little bit of disenfranchisement that, is like a drop in a bucket of a lot of disenfranchisement. But there's this concern that not only are you losing your cultural identity to some degree, you're losing access to heritage, that, sometimes your burial grounds, your traditional areas of culture, of traditional food gathering. This all is in flux, but you then also on top of that might lose your political power, what little you have, because you just upended the US government's idea of what is a village and who gets to vote.
Well, okay, so I'm getting questions from the community room, and this relates to some of these things you're talking about. And Mike asked, I think this is a policy question. Are there government programs that you know of to help address these problems that you have highlighted? Any adaptation efforts to preserve their culture and adapt? So many specific programs that you're there with, I guess, this project kind of helping with that.
So I heard a presentation. It was a National Adaptation Forum seminar, just I think it was last week even, and Robin Bronin from the Alaska Institute for Justice and others on that call were, that was the question that kept coming up, is where is the leadership coming from in the government? And there is no national plan for moving communities out of harm's way because of climate change. There is no overarching governmental, like the question of at what point is it unsafe? Where do we get resources? All of this is piecemeal. And so people are having to find funding from 30 different small grants to fund pieces of a moving process that really should be one unified planning process with one unified funding source. So right now it's a mess, basically. And it's contingent on a tribal community having the resources to go find these resources and make those grant applications and make the case for moving. So this leaves out poorer communities that don't have that capacity. So that's another structural issue, is communities may just fall through the cracks because they don't have a grant writer, or they don't have that special connection to that lawyer that, Newtek has access to. What we need is a greater, basically a higher profile in both Russia and the United States and in Canada for these communities that need special assistance, and they need it to be consistent, and they need it to be, not these piecemeal little grants and your occasional government inquiry as to, oh, didn't you need to move 30 years ago? Where are you with that?
I'll get back to you. Well, it sounds like you've been studying this across the different countries, and I guess that's a unique sort of window. And you've got Russia, you've got the United States, you've got Canada dealing with these populations. Is there one that does it better than the other, and then why? Or are they all pretty bad?
Something that nobody really wants to talk about is returning land rights to Native people. The governments of, I am actually not that familiar with the Canadian case, but I don't think they're far afield from where the US and Russia are in terms of, we'll help you with this discrete problem, regarding erosion or access to food, but we won't give you the right to dictate the law of your land. Like that is hard for governments to do. And Russia technically, on the books, if you just look at the letter of the law, at least it used to be when I was doing this work, they were much, much better than the US in terms of allowing autonomy to indigenous people. And that came from the Soviet culture of, we don't have the technology to extract the resources underneath you, so why don't you just continue living on your land and doing what you've always done? They had this kind of in perpetuity, free access to their traditional areas of natural resource use. And so it's like, go ahead, do your thing. We don't care. And then they got the technology to get the resources out from, steep. They started being able to extract timber from steep cliff sides that they didn't used to be able to access. They started being able to get oil from ground that was more rocky. Like all these technologies started to come out, and suddenly they got more interested in the land underneath the areas of traditional nature use. And these communities started to get told, you need to move, they're getting pushed around, and they're having to beg for scraps. And what they end up getting they get money sometimes, and the money is not dictated to go to helping them manage their land. It is dictated to, why don't you have a dance festival? Let's celebrate your culture that we just tried to annihilate. These kinds of piecemeal drips and drops of assistance that are better than nothing, but there is no, again, in Russia and in the US, there's no concerted, focused effort to help these communities adapt. They're on their own.
I think from what we've heard, Barrett Ristroff, right? You've crossed paths with Barrett, and some of the legal implications. Is that kind of, do you work with her? I mean, do you get involved with kind of those issues, providing, I guess, policy support and such?
So Barrett came on to working at Pacific Environment soon after I left there. So we have colleagues in common from that, and we've been in touch over the years. And I'm very, we're both in the American Society for Adaptation Professionals. So we keep in touch and we cross paths often, but I am not involved in the move of Nutuk to Merkavik, which is her main focus as far as I understand.
We've talked to her a couple times on Cimpatico. I was just curious because, a lot of my background, even in this topic, is she goes between New Orleans and Alaska quite a bit. Well, I'm curious. I'd asked about the other countries, but what about the current state of, let's say Alaska and the federal government? Are they okay partners, or do they have, a lot more room for improvement?
Well, obviously there's room for improvement, but the Denali Commission, as far as I understand it, which is a commission that helps to it provides assistance to Native Alaskan organizations. They have been stepping up and doing a good job at trying to assist communities that are in the process of deciding to move or are moving. And so that is, as far as I understand it, a good partner that's coming from the governmental side that is trying to do the right thing and trying to make sure that the tribes are involved in the hazard mitigation plans that they're developing. And of course, there's room for improvement. For example, those hazard mitigation plans are supposed to be translated into the local language, and they are not usually. So many Native Alaskans speak English, but not all of them. And maybe your tribal elders who need to be the decision makers don't. So language access needs to be improved. And also just making sure that the community is the one that makes the call on this. These are our measures by which we are judging our need to move. And we are going to, at this threshold measure, we're going to move at that point. That shouldn't be dictated from outside.
What about the tribal folks in the lower 48, and some of them having to deal with translocation? Famously in Louisiana, is there much overlap in sort of the issues that they're having to deal with, and the resources allocated, or I guess interest from the federal government? Are they learning from each other? Is there communication going on?
Yes, the Ilda Jean Charles band has been in touch with the Nutuk community for years. I'm familiar with at least one or two efforts to keep them in touch and make sure that they are sharing lessons learned and supporting each other. But they are in very different situations. The legal standing is different for these tribes. The identity of the tribes, like how they form their identity, is different. And the decision-making process is more piecemeal in Ile de Jean Charles. It is, as far as I know, not unanimous that they want to move. So this is leading to a more piecemeal approach. Whereas Nutuk, it's really evident that I think that they've got more consensus there. And I mean, this is reflective of every tribal community has a different profile of who is, the degree of consensus and the degree of actually evidence that they need to move. And in lower 48, it's not different. It's the same. Every tribal community's decision-making process and profile of risk is unique.
Okay, so we're actually at the end of the episode, Sarah, and what's next for you? I know you just took a new position in California, but like you said, every time you get away, they drag you back into what you were doing. And so,
I'm happy to help. I'm never dragged. I always come running.
I was just trying to do a little Godfather there, but that's all right.
I know.
No, but what is next? I guess, and it's just when things come up, you're there because you're interested in staying involved, right?
Yeah, I mean, so this is not a sprint. This is a marathon. I want to make my resources available where I can to the communities that I've supported always. And they have a window. I wanted to just mention that they have a window of opportunity in Russia in the aftermath of the Norilsk diesel fuel spill that happened at the end of May. There was an interesting opportunity to see the government and the Nornickel company both agree that permafrost thawing was to blame, at least in part, for this fuel spill when a tank ruptured. And it turned into pretty quickly a process where the company was able to do an assessment of damage, find 700 individual Native people who had been harmed, like with measurable harm, and they compensated them and provided a $20 million fund for that community to help with whatever next steps are for recovery. However, you may know that in the Arctic, cleaning up oil spills is not really a thing. You can't really do it. It's just not. It doesn't work. You can do some mitigation of harm, but it is kind of forever when you spill oil in the Arctic. So, sorry, that's not a positive note to end on. But in Russia, you have this sort of unprecedented moment of there is a climate change related impact. Everyone agrees it's climate change related, and they do an assessment of harm and they provide recompense. So this is now going to give every tribal community in Russia a point to touch on when they go forward trying to advocate for themselves. Okay,
well, no, I guess all these individual developments are useful, hopefully, in other communities learning lessons. Well, Sarah, this has been great. Scratching the surface on the topics to cover on this issue, but I appreciate you coming on. Now, I want to take you into just chatting in a second here just to close this out, but thanks for coming on and thanks for what you're doing.
Yeah, I'm happy to share information about this, and I'm planning to put some resources up on my website, which is pacificadaptation.blogspot.com.
There'll be a website for this episode. Well, I mean, a page, and anything that you want us to include under this episode, we'll be happy to do. That'd be great. All right, just hold on one sec. We're going to go into just chatting.